Last chance human, the shy alien girl's dangerous ultimatum. Deep in the silent reaches of space, far from the bustling heart of the galaxy, the galactic border station stood like a forgotten outpost, its steel walls reflecting the harsh, unrelenting light of the artificial star above. Here, on the frontier of known space, time didn't seem to flow the same way. The days blurred together, and the quiet hum of machinery filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional communications alert or the footsteps of the few souls who called this place home. Inside the station's central control room, Henry Riddler stood hunched over a quantum alignment scanner. His hands moved almost mechanically across the touch panel, making adjustments with the precision of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times before. His muscular arms flexed beneath his gray tactical suit, the fabric pulling tightly around his biceps. The buzz of the scanner was a familiar comfort, a steady beat in the otherwise still air of the station. But tonight, something felt off. It wasn't the machinery, it was the space around him. A feeling, a presence, lingering just out of sight. Still doing it wrong, human. The voice, smooth and melodic, cut through the silence like a knife. Henry didn't even need to look up to know who it was. He had spent more time with Lieutenant Hala than anyone else in the galaxy, and her voice had become something he could recognize in an instant. The deep, almost otherworldly tone of her silver eyes flashed in his mind, though he knew better than to let his thoughts wander. Without lifting his head, he responded, "I'm following the protocol," his tone flat, masking the brief flicker of irritation. Force of habit. It was all about force of habit. Behind him, Hala's footsteps grew louder, her presence closing in. The air around him seemed to shift as she moved, her natural grace filling the space. He could feel her, feel the subtle pull of her energy even before she came into view. She was always like that, impossible to ignore. She was tall, her skin a brilliant shade of green that shimmered in the harsh light of the control room. Her dark emerald hair cascaded down her back in gentle waves, framing her sharp features. Every step she took was purposeful, calculated, like a predator stalking its prey, except Henry wasn't prey. Or, at least, that's what he told himself. "You're still using the old imperial calibration," she clarified, moving closer until her breath was warm against his neck. Henry resisted the urge to shiver, focusing on the task in front of him. "We updated those protocols last cycle." Her words were sharp, a reminder of the constant evolution of technology, of how things never stayed the same out here in the frontier. He should have known better. "I know," he muttered, though he didn't move. "Old habits die hard." She didn't let him off the hook that easily. Hala was never one to back down when it came to precision. Her finger swiped across the interface with a practiced ease, tapping commands that he'd ignored. For a moment, he couldn't help but notice the way her arm brushed against his chest, the slightest touch sending a ripple of electricity through him. It wasn't the static from the equipment. No, it was something far more dangerous. "Humans," she said, a playful lilt in her voice as she leaned over him, so resistant to change. Henry gritted his teeth, his heart pounding a little too fast in his chest. He tried to focus, tried to keep his eyes on the screen, but that was becoming increasingly difficult. There was something about her, something about the way she stood so close, the way her perfume, a heady mix of spice and something else he couldn't quite place, lingered in the air. He could feel her warmth, her presence, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat just inches away from his own. And then, just when he thought he might lose his grip on the situation completely, Hala did the unthinkable. She brushed against him, her body pressing lightly against his side. The contact, casual and brief, was enough to send a shockwave through his senses. "Speaking of change," she murmured, her voice low and teasing, "I've been thinking about what we should do next." Henry stiffened and a knot formed in his stomach. "Dangerous pastime," he responded, though he couldn't suppress the slight tremor in his voice. He was used to the way she challenged him, used to the way she pushed the boundaries, but he had no idea where this conversation was going. Hala didn't take her eyes off him. "We've been dancing around this for months now," she continued, crossing her arms beneath her chest, the movement accentuating her athletic form. The flirting, the tension. Don't pretend you haven't felt it too. Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. Of course he'd felt it. Anyone would have. The way she looked at him, the way her eyes gleamed like molten silver, the way their interactions had become charged with something neither of them could ignore. They had been walking a razor's edge for weeks, and now it felt like they were teetering on the brink. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, threatening to spill over. "We can't," he said, his voice almost pleading, but there was something else in it too, a desire he could no longer deny. "Can't what?" Hala challenged, stepping closer until she was almost against him. "Can't admit that we're attracted to each other. Can't acknowledge that we're both adults with needs and desires. Can't do something about it." Henry's pulse quickened and he took a step back, his back hitting the console behind him. The cold metal pressed against him, grounding him for a moment. But that moment didn't last long. Her gaze, so intense, held him captive. "The regulations don't apply out here," she said, her voice a whisper now, her lips barely brushing his ear. "We're in the frontier. The old rules don't matter anymore." It was as if time stopped. The hum of the station faded into the background, and all that existed was Hala's scent, her warmth, and the undeniable pull between them. Everything, duty, responsibility, even the mission, faded into nothing as he stood there, caught between the person he had always been and the person he could be with her. With a growl, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a kiss. It wasn't slow. It wasn't tentative. It was raw, immediate, and intense, everything he had held back until that moment. And when they finally broke apart, their breath mingled in the still air, the weight of what they had just done hanging heavy between them. "What now?" Henry whispered, his voice hoarse. Hala's lips curved into a smile, her eyes sparkling. "Now we face whatever comes next." Before Henry could respond, the shrill beep of the communication system cut through the silence. "Lieutenant Riddler, Lieutenant Hala, Commander Thax requires your presence in his office, immediately." It was the worst timing, but also the most fitting. Their worlds had just collided, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences. The unexpected kiss. The sudden shrill beeping of the station's comm system shattered the tense silence that had settled between Henry and Hala. It was as though the universe had just slapped them back into reality. "Lieutenant Riddler, Lieutenant Hala, Commander Thax requires your presence in his office, immediately." The cold, mechanical voice sounded too loud, too sharp, cutting through the warmth that lingered between them like a warning. Henry, still dazed from their kiss, blinked hard, his breath shallow. His fingers were still tingling from the contact, and his mind was racing. For a moment he just stood there, unsure whether to laugh or curse. "You're not kidding," he muttered, glancing at Hala. She stood there, still close, her breath warm against his skin, her eyes flashing with a mixture of amusement and something deeper. Her lips were still curved in a satisfied smile, as if she was waiting for him to catch up. "I don't think the commander will be as thrilled about our sudden change in routine," Henry added, running a hand through his tousled hair, trying to compose himself. He wasn't sure whether he was talking about the kiss or the consequences that would undoubtedly follow. Hala's expression softened, but the mischievous glint in her silver eyes remained. "You should know better by now, Lieutenant. I don't care about Thax. Rules." Her voice was low and dangerous, the words thick with a kind of confidence that Henry had come to admire and fear over the past few years. Henry wasn't so sure. Commander Thax, with his crystalline exoskeleton and his intimidating presence, wasn't someone you crossed easily. He had a reputation for handling problems with ruthless efficiency. And right now, Henry and Hala were the problem. Still, despite the knot of dread twisting in his stomach, he couldn't stop the tug of something else, the pull of her, the undeniable chemistry that had ignited between them. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything. The tension, the shared glances, the unspoken words. And now the door had been opened. There was no going back. But before they could even respond, Hala took a step back, her expression turning slightly more serious. Her fingers, which had been tracing the edges of his chest only moments before, withdrew, and she reached for her bodysuit. The fabric stretched as she pulled it over her athletic frame, each movement fluid and practiced, a stark reminder of her professional prowess. "Let's get this over with," she said, her voice almost too calm, too controlled. "We've already crossed the line. Now we deal with whatever comes next." Henry watched her, momentarily caught in the way her body moved, effortless and graceful. The sight of her, now dressed in her black bodysuit, the fabric hugging her in all the right places, did nothing to calm the fire inside him. If anything, it made it worse. "Right," Henry said, straightening himself and forcing his thoughts back into place. He adjusted his own uniform, though he felt like a completely different person now than he had just an hour ago. No use delaying the inevitable. They made their way through the station's narrow, sterile hallways, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Every so often their fingers brushed against one another, and each time the contact sent sparks through Henry's veins. It was a reminder, one he couldn't seem to escape, that things had changed. Hala, for all her controlled demeanor, was unusually quiet. She walked ahead of him, her posture perfect, but there was a subtle shift in her movements. Her pace was just a little faster than normal, a slight tension in the way she carried herself. It was the kind of tension that made Henry wonder if she was just as unsure about the aftermath of their kiss as he was. As they approached Commander Thax's office, the door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. There he stood, tall and imposing, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the light from the overhead lamps. His four eyes, sharp and unblinking, studied them as they entered. "Sit," Thax commanded, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. His voice was deep, resonant like the rumble of distant thunder. Henry took his seat first, trying to keep his nerves under control. He could feel Hala's presence beside him, the intensity of their shared moment still lingering between them. Neither of them spoke, though Henry could sense the weight of the situation pressing in on them from all sides. For a long moment, Thax said nothing. His eyes flicked between them, a look of quiet observation in his gaze before he finally spoke. "I assume you both know why you're here," he said, his tone flat but authoritative. Henry's stomach twisted. He had expected this. The security feeds would have caught every second of their interaction. The kiss, the flirtation, it was all there, recorded for the entire station to see. "About last night," Henry began, trying to sound casual, though his voice was tight. "No," Thax interrupted, his expression unreadable. "About your behavior." There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence, and then, to Henry's surprise, Thax's voice softened, just a fraction. "Your actions violate station protocols. You both know this. However," he trailed off, his four eyes narrowing as if considering something, "given your exceptional performance during missions, I'm willing to overlook the breach for now." Henry blinked, unable to process the words immediately. Hala didn't react, but the faintest flicker of something passed through her silver eyes, something that hinted at surprise. "I am not without flexibility," Thax continued, "but you will both file the necessary relationship disclosure forms, and you will maintain the highest level of professionalism during duty hours. There will be no exceptions." Hala's gaze never wavered as she listened, but Henry couldn't help the small, almost involuntary grin that tugged at his lips. They were going to get away with this. "For future encounters," Thax added, "ensure they take place in private quarters and disable the security feeds. Understood?" Hala smirked. "Understood, Commander," she said, her voice smooth and almost too nonchalant. Henry managed a nod, but the relief was short-lived. There was still the matter of the mission, and the ever-present knowledge that their relationship was now exposed, out in the open. The unspoken question lingered between them, hanging in the air like a weight neither could escape. "Dismissed," Thax said with a wave of his hand, as if all of this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As they stood and turned to leave, Hala couldn't hold back her laughter. "Your face," she gasped, trying to stifle the sound. "You looked like you were facing execution." Henry couldn't help but smile despite himself. "Excuse me for taking our careers seriously." They left Thax's office, the tension between them shifting into something new, something unspoken. There was no going back now. The mission, the station, and everything else would have to wait. The consequence of choices. The walk to Commander Thax's office felt like an eternity. The sterile halls of the galactic border station stretched before them, each step echoing like the beat of a distant drum. Henry could hear his own heart pounding, a steady reminder of what had just happened, and what could be coming next. He glanced over at Hala, her expression unreadable, though he could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. She moved with the same fluidity as always, her steps precise, yet there was a quiet storm in the air between them. The kiss had changed things, no matter how they tried to play it cool. "Still think this was a good idea," Henry muttered, more to himself than to her. Hala's silver eyes flicked to him, her lips curling in a half-smile. "Do you regret it?" Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she hadn't just kissed him like her life depended on it. But there was a slight edge to her words, a sharpness that told him she was just as aware of the stakes as he was. He thought for a moment. The intensity of the kiss still lingered in his mind, and the heat between them hadn't dissipated, even as the cold, mechanical hum of the station surrounded them. "No," he said quietly, the word feeling strange but true. "No regrets." Hala gave a small, satisfied nod, as if that was all she needed to hear. But then her lips tightened, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "I hope you're right," she said softly, more to herself than to him. As they reached the heavy doors to Commander Thax's office, the tension between them reached its peak. The door hissed open, and they stepped into the commander's domain, an austere room with towering walls of black metal, where every detail felt intentionally cold and imposing. Thax was already waiting behind his desk, his 4 eyes trained on them with unblinking intensity. "Sit," he commanded, his voice gravelly yet calm. Henry and Hala both sat in the chairs opposite him, maintaining an air of professionalism even though their minds were racing. They exchanged a brief glance before focusing on Thax, whose crystalline exoskeleton shimmered under the harsh lighting. He was a formidable presence, his very being an alien manifestation of power. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Thax finally spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Do you know why you're here?" His eyes flicked between them with a calculating gleam. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but Hala beat him to it. "We know," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We're here because we broke the rules." Thax's expression remained unreadable, his crystal-like features reflecting the light like 1,000 shards of glass. "Not just the rules," he said. "You've violated more than just station protocol. You've crossed the line that cannot be uncrossed." Henry felt a cold knot in his stomach tighten at those words. He had been expecting some kind of reprimand, some kind of official consequence. But Thax's tone made it clear that this was about something more, something that was about to change everything. "What happens now?" Henry asked, his voice tight but controlled. He had no intention of backing down, not now. He wasn't the kind of man who could be easily intimidated, especially not by Thax. Thax leaned back in his chair, his 4 eyes narrowing as he studied them both. The silence stretched out again, but this time it was different. This was the silence before a storm. "You will face consequences," Thax began slowly. "The security systems recorded everything, your behavior, your actions, your choices." He let the word hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Hala stiffened beside him, her jaw clenching. "What exactly are you suggesting, Commander?" she asked, her voice betraying no fear, only a razor-sharp edge. Thax paused for a moment as if weighing his words carefully. Your actions are not without consequence, he repeated. You will file the necessary relationship disclosure forms, of course, and you will maintain professionalism during duty hours. That is non-negotiable. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't the harsh reprimand he had expected, but he wasn't about to let his guard down just yet. Thax's eyes glinted with something else, something that made the hair on the back of Henry's neck stand up. However, Thax continued, his voice lower now, I'm willing to be flexible. You've both served with excellence. And while I could, he hesitated, his eyes scanning them both, order your immediate reassignment, I will not. You've proven yourselves valuable to this station. Hala's eyes never left Thax, and for a moment, Henry was sure she was considering the weight of his words. They were being offered a second chance, but it came with conditions. And those conditions felt like the kind of unspoken contract that could bind them to more than just duty. Your partnership, Thax said, his gaze shifting between them, is strong. That much is clear, but you will not let your personal relationship interfere with your responsibilities. He leaned forward slightly, his four eyes fixed on them with an almost predatory intensity. If you fail, I will not hesitate to act. Henry exchanged a glance with Hala, the unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a warning. This was a test, a line drawn in the sand. And if we succeed? Henry asked, his voice steady. Thax's lips twisted into something that could have been a smile, though it was hard to tell with his crystalline features. If you succeed, he said slowly, then perhaps you'll be given the opportunity to prove that humans and aliens can work together in more ways than just professional. Hala's lips curled into a smirk. We'll manage, Commander, we always do. Good, Thax replied, his tone sharp. Because the next mission is already on the horizon, and I expect you both to be at your best. The meeting ended abruptly, the words still hanging heavily in the air as they made their way out of Thax's office. As the door slid shut behind them, Henry couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. They had been given a second chance, but something about the way Thax spoke, about the weight of the unspoken threats, left him with a lingering unease. As they walked back down the long hallway, Henry stole a glance at Hala, wondering what she was thinking. So what now? He asked, the question hanging between them like a bridge between the past and the future. Hala didn't answer right away. Instead, she stopped, turning to face him with that familiar, knowing look in her silver eyes. Now, she said, her voice soft but filled with determination, we prove we can handle this. Together. The walk to the station's operations deck felt different now, heavier. But with an undeniable spark of something more. They had faced the consequences of their actions, and now they would face whatever came next. Together. The mission beyond the edge. The shuttle's engines hummed low, a constant vibration beneath Henry's feet as he strapped himself into the cockpit seat. The steady beat of the pulse echoed in his chest, matching the rhythmic thrum of the engines. The metallic walls of the shuttle, cold and unyielding, felt strangely comforting in this moment. He was used to the isolation, the quiet of space, but now there was something different. Something about Hala, something about their mission. It wasn't just another routine assignment. Beside him, Hala adjusted her tactical gear with an ease that reminded him of just how sharp she was. Her silver eyes were focused on the readouts flashing across the console, but Henry noticed the slight tension in her posture. She was always in control, but there was something in the way she held herself today that felt different. Ready? Henry asked, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. Hala's lips curled into a faint smile, her voice smooth, but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Always. She paused, then added, it's not the mission I'm worried about, Riddler. Henry raised an eyebrow. Oh, what is it then? Hala didn't look at him, but her lips parted ever so slightly as she spoke. It's what comes after. His heart skipped a beat. After. Their interaction in Commander Thax's office still weighed on his mind. The look in Hala's eyes after the meeting had left him wondering. They hadn't spoken much about it since, and part of him had hoped they wouldn't need to. But now, with the mission ahead of them, there was no more hiding behind duty. Before he could respond, the shuttle's intercom buzzed, a sharp, electronic voice filling the cabin. Approaching RX 792, 1 minute to landing, prepare for descent. The abruptness of the announcement left no room for further conversation, and just like that, all personal thoughts and doubts vanished as the adrenaline kicked in. The mission, this dangerous high-stakes mission, was no longer something to postpone. The research team on RX 792 had gone silent. The scientists had uncovered something important, something the Galactic Science Council considered a top priority. And now, Henry and Hala had to figure out why. As the shuttle descended through the stormy atmosphere of RX 792, the view outside the window was chaotic. Thick clouds roiled like a storm had taken hold of the entire planet, streaking the sky with violent flashes of lightning. Beneath them, jagged mountains and deep canyons carved their way through the desolate landscape. The air outside felt almost alive, charged with an electric energy that made the hairs on the back of Henry's neck stand on end. The ground grew closer, and the shuttle rocked with each gust of wind, but Hala's hand remained steady on the controls. It was moments like these that Henry found himself marveling at her. How, even in the most perilous situations, she was the picture of calm efficiency. But he could tell something was off. He could feel it in the way she gripped the console, in the sharpness of her eyes. The shuttle touched down with a jarring thud, the landing gear taking the brunt of the impact. The atmosphere inside the cabin was thick with the anticipation of what lay ahead. "Let's go," Hala said, her voice like a command but softer, like she was trying to push past something more personal. They both stood, moving quickly toward the shuttle's rear hatch. Henry took a deep breath, preparing himself for the unknown. There was no going back now. The storm outside was ferocious, and the planet's hostile environment made the entire mission feel like a ticking clock. As they exited the shuttle and stepped onto the jagged, rocky ground of RX 792, the wind whipped around them with a vicious bite. The air was thin and dry, carrying the scent of something wild, like the planet itself had been waiting for them. The research team's camp was barely visible through the dust and rain, its tents flapping violently against the howling wind. "We need to move fast," Hala said, already adjusting her weapon and checking her equipment. Henry nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his own weapon. The moment he stepped into the storm, the sense of unease that had been building in his chest grew stronger. Something wasn't right about this planet, and it wasn't just the weather. They moved through the storm toward the research team's last known location, their boots crunching against the rocky surface, the wind howling in their ears. The flashes of lightning illuminated the jagged cliffs and deep crevices of the canyon, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. Hala led the way, her movements efficient and fluid, as if she could navigate this planet in her sleep. Henry followed closely behind, trying to keep pace with her, but his mind kept drifting back to the brief conversation they'd shared on the shuttle. The look in her eyes had been different, vulnerable even, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They finally reached the research camp. What they found made his stomach drop. The camp was in disarray. Tents were torn, supplies scattered across the rocky ground. The air smelled faintly of smoke as if something had burned recently, but there were no signs of life. No research team members, no scientists, just the wreckage of a once thriving operation, now abandoned. "They're gone," Henry muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. "Where the hell is everyone?" Hala knelt beside the remains of a charred tent, her silver eyes scanning the area, her expression unreadable. "They didn't just vanish," she said softly, almost to herself. "Something happened here, something forced them to leave." Before Henry could respond, a low growl echoed from the canyon. His body tensed, every muscle instinctively going on alert. Hala looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Predators," she whispered almost too calmly. He didn't need her to elaborate. He could feel it, the presence, the weight of something large and dangerous moving just beyond their vision. He hadn't seen it yet, but he could sense it. The air was thick with the smell of something predatory, something that was hunting them. "We need shelter," Hala said, standing and pulling him toward the nearby cliffside. "Now." They both sprinted toward a narrow fissure in the rock, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The growls grew louder closer, and the storm's violent winds made it difficult to hear anything else. Henry's hand tightened around his weapon, but deep down, he knew there was more to this mission than they'd been told. More than just missing scientists. The planet itself was a predator, and it had its eyes on them. As they ducked into the narrow cave, the first strike hit. The ground trembled as something massive collided with the cliffside, shaking the rocks above them. The air around them thickened, and Henry could feel his pulse racing. He looked at Hala, her eyes gleaming with determination, her body already prepared for whatever came next. "This just got a lot more interesting," she murmured, her lips curling into a predatory smile. Henry felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold but from the primal energy in the air. This mission, this planet, whatever they had walked into, it was no longer just about saving the scientists. It was about survival. And he wasn't sure if they were ready for what was coming next. The heart of the storm. The cave was a refuge, a temporary one. The narrow fissure they had ducked into barely shielded them from the full force of the storm outside, but it was enough to buy them a few precious moments of respite. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint glow of their tactical lights cast eerie shadows on the jagged rock walls. The ground beneath them was uneven, the stones slick with moisture from the torrential rain outside. Henry crouched, scanning the narrow entrance of the cave for any signs of movement. His senses were heightened, his mind sharp, every muscle coiled in readiness. Hala, as always, moved with an effortless grace beside him, though even she seemed to be on edge. She was still, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a furnace. The growls from outside had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of calm. It was the kind of stillness that came just before something terrible happened. "We need to make a move," Hala said, her voice quiet but firm, her gaze fixed on the entrance. "If those things are still out there, we can't afford to wait long." Henry nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. There was something deeper in his gut, something that told him this mission had become more than just a rescue operation. Whatever had happened to the research team, whatever dangers these predators posed, they weren't random. This planet was not a simple backwater outpost. It was alive with something darker, something far more ancient. He couldn't shake the feeling that the predators, the storm, even the strange energy in the air, it was all connected. Hala was already moving, her weapon held tight in her hands. She was in full mission mode now, the playful edge from earlier replaced with the icy focus that made her so dangerous in a firefight. She glanced at him, her silver eyes piercing through the gloom of the cave. "Stay alert," she warned, her voice low. "If we don't get out of here soon, we'll be the next prey." Henry moved to follow, but something in her tone stopped him. It wasn't just the danger outside. It was the way she said it, the weight of unspoken words, the undertone of something deeper. He took a step closer, their faces just inches apart in the dim light. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his breath catching as the air between them crackled with something charged. Hala didn't flinch. Her gaze softened for the briefest of moments before it hardened again, the moment passing like a shadow. "I mean," she said carefully, "that I've been doing this long enough to know when something is off, and this planet, it's hiding something. The predators aren't the only threat." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "You think it's the research team, that they triggered something?" Hala didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped past him, the soft rustle of her gear the only sound. "The team wasn't just studying the planet's wildlife," she said finally, her voice tight. "They were investigating something much older, Whatever they found, it's not just dangerous, it's powerful, and we've just walked straight into the heart of it. Henry swallowed hard. The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. They were no longer just rescuers. They were intruders, and the planet had already begun to push back. They stepped out of the cave, the storm still howling around them. The wind slapped at their faces, and the sky above crackled with lightning. Every gust seemed to carry with it the scent of something burning, something unnatural. The research camp lay just ahead, the remnants of the tents and equipment strewn across the rocky landscape like the bones of a long-dead creature. Hala was already moving toward the main tent, her posture alert, scanning the horizon with the precision of a trained hunter. Henry followed, his mind racing, but his steps falling into sync with hers. He couldn't afford to dwell on the unease growing in his chest, not yet, not until they knew more. When they reached the heart of the camp, the first thing that struck Henry was the stillness. It wasn't the silence of a camp abandoned in haste. No, this was different. There were signs that the team had left quickly, equipment left half-finished, papers scattered in the wind, but there was something wrong about how it all sat, as if everything had been meticulously left behind, deliberately abandoned. "Check the data pads," Hala ordered, her tone clipped. "See if they've left any clues behind, something not adding up." Henry knelt beside one of the scattered devices, his fingers moving quickly over the interface. As he powered it up, the screen flickered to life, casting a harsh light against the shadowed landscape. He scrolled through the data, his eyes narrowing at the encrypted files that had been left behind. "Whatever they found, they didn't want it to be found," he muttered under his breath, his pulse quickening. There were files here, files that were far too encrypted for standard research. Hala's voice broke through the tension. "Did they leave a message?" Henry's fingers flew over the keypad, but the data was locked. Whoever had been here was either highly cautious or terribly paranoid. He glanced up at Hala, who had now crouched beside one of the collapsed tents, examining something with a frown. "The team didn't leave anything for us to find," Henry said, frustration lining his voice. "We're not going to crack this without the right tools." Hala stood, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Maybe it's not the data that's important." Henry turned, following her gaze, and his stomach dropped. From the depths of the canyon, emerging like a specter from the storm, something moved. It was massive, its form a blur of motion against the darkening landscape, but Henry knew instinctively what it was. A predator, no, multiple predators slithering through the shadows. Their massive bodies, 6 limbs rippling with muscular power, moved in unison as they tested the air, their eyes glowing in the dim light. "They're coming," Hala said, her voice low, steady. "And they're not just hunting us, they're hunting what we're looking for." For the first time since landing on RX 792, Henry felt the full weight of their situation crash down on him. It wasn't just survival anymore. It wasn't just a rescue mission. They were part of something far bigger, something that had been waiting, something ancient and dangerous, hidden beneath the surface of the planet. And whatever it was drawing them in, just as it had drawn in the research team. The predators weren't just guarding the planet, they were protecting something far more valuable. Henry locked eyes with Hala. "We need to find the truth before they find us." She nodded once, her eyes flashing with that dangerous resolve that had always made her an unstoppable force. "Then let's make sure we don't get caught." Together they moved toward the heart of the camp. But with every step, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them, a storm far darker than the one raging outside. And for the first time, Henry knew that whatever secrets RX 792 was hiding, it wasn't just a planet, it was a battleground. Beneath the surface, the storm outside seemed to rage with a life of its own. The wind howled like a living thing, thrashing against the jagged cliffs of RX 792, and the lightning crackled across the sky in sharp, blinding streaks. But inside the research camp, beneath the tattered remnants of what was once a thriving outpost, there was a new kind of stillness. a dangerous kind. Henry stood at the edge of the main tent, staring at the strange, glowing formation on the ground. It had been hidden beneath a tarp, almost as if someone had wanted to keep it secret. The last traces of the research team's hurried departure were scattered around them, but it was this discovery that had both of them frozen in place. "What in the stars?" Henry murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Hala moved closer, her boots crunching on the rocky ground, her expression unreadable. The silver of her eyes glinted in the dim light as she knelt beside him, studying the strange glowing crystals embedded deep in the earth. Their light pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, almost as if they were alive. "They were studying this," Hala said, her voice low, cautious. She ran a gloved hand over the surface of one of the larger crystals. "It's not just a formation, it's a techno-organic structure." Henry frowned, looking down at the crystals. The pulsating glow wasn't the only strange thing about them. As his boots shifted over the stone beneath, he felt a faint hum, the same kind of energy that ran through his veins when he was near a high-voltage power source. It was alive, but different. "A techno-organic structure," Henry echoed, shaking his head. "What does that even mean?" Hala's gaze flickered toward the rest of the camp, her mind clearly elsewhere as she pieced the puzzle together. "It means this is more than just a natural phenomenon," she said. "The predators we've seen, the storm outside, this entire planet seems to be alive in a way we didn't anticipate." Her voice was edged with the rare hint of uncertainty. "And it's connected to these crystals." Henry crouched beside her, his hand brushing against the nearest crystal. The moment his fingers made contact, his entire body jolted. It wasn't painful, but the rush of sensation was intense, overwhelming. Like an electric current ran through his body, awakening something deep inside him. He pulled his hand away instinctively, his breath coming out in a sharp gasp. Hala's eyes widened as she observed him. "You felt it too?" Henry nodded, still shaking off the lingering sensation. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The crystals pulsed again, their glow intensifying for just a fraction of a second. Henry's instincts screamed at him to move, to get away from the source of that energy, but something held him in place. There was a strange pull in the air now. It wasn't just the storm outside. It was something in the earth beneath them. The crystals wanted them to stay. Suddenly, a sound interrupted their thoughts, a soft, almost inaudible clicking noise, followed by the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Henry straightened up, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "Something out there," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Hala was already moving. "Predators?" she asked, her voice sharp and calculating. "No, not just predators," Henry replied, scanning the area. He could feel it now, the weight in the air. The kind of tension that came just before something huge was about to happen. "There's something else, something behind this, the predators. They're not the only ones hunting us." Hala didn't hesitate. She quickly adjusted her weapon and began making her way toward the perimeter of the camp, her movements fluid, her every sense on high alert. "Let's find out what's behind it." Henry followed her, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as they moved toward the edge of the camp. The faint glow of the crystals behind them flickered, almost as if they were alive, aware of their every movement. The storm outside was deafening now, the wind howling and the lightning flashing so violently that it was hard to tell where the sky ended and the ground began. But despite the chaos of the weather, there was something almost serene in the way the camp seemed to settle around them, as though the planet itself was watching, waiting. They reached the outer perimeter, where the terrain began to drop into the deep, twisted canyon that wound its way through the heart of RX 792. The ground beneath their boots felt unstable, as if something beneath it was shifting. Hala stopped abruptly, her expression intense. She held up a hand, signaling Henry to stop. He did immediately, his heart pounding in his chest. They both listened in silence, the storm's roar muffled for a moment. It was then that they heard it, distant but unmistakable, a low, rhythmic thrum like the beating of a heart. "It's coming from below," Hala murmured, her silver eyes wide with realization. Henry's throat tightened. "What the hell is this place?" Before Hala could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The pulse of energy from the crystals intensified, and the storm outside grew louder, fiercer. The hum beneath them turned into something more, a growl, like the sound of a living creature awakening from a long slumber. "We need to move now," Henry barked, his mind racing. He grabbed Hala's arm, pulling her back toward the camp's central area where they had last seen signs of life. But they didn't make it far. From the depths of the canyon, a shape emerged, its outline barely visible through the haze of rain and smoke. It was massive, taller than any predator they had seen before, its skin a dark, cracked hue that shimmered with the same pulsing light as the crystals. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, as though it had been waiting for them. For a moment, neither Henry nor Hala moved. They stood frozen, facing the impossibility of what was unfolding before them. "What is that?" Henry whispered, unable to tear his eyes away from the creature that seemed to materialize from the very storm itself. "I think," Hala's voice was barely audible, "I think we just woke it up." The ground beneath them trembled again, and Henry's heart raced. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a predator. It was the heart of the planet itself. Hala turned to him, her face hardening with determination. "We don't have time to wait. We need to destroy those crystals." Henry nodded, his breath catching in his chest. "Before it destroys us." With the storm howling around them and the creature advancing with terrifying purpose, they didn't hesitate. Together, they ran toward the glowing crystal formation, knowing that what happened next would determine not just their survival, but the fate of everything this planet had been hiding. The heart of the beast. The creature was almost upon them now, its massive form looming through the storm, a nightmare made flesh, its shape barely visible but undeniably present. The air around it shimmered with a strange energy, an energy that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the glowing crystals beneath their feet. Every step it took sent a deep tremor through the ground, as if the very earth was responding to its presence. Henry's heart raced as he and Hala sprinted toward the glowing formation, the pulse of the crystals growing stronger with every step. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was drawn to the crystals, to what they had discovered. And in that moment, Henry understood the full scope of what they were dealing with. RX 792 wasn't just a planet. It was an ancient, living entity, a place of power, of darkness, of purpose. Behind them, the sound of the creature's footfalls grew louder, echoing in the night like thunder. Every movement it made seemed deliberate, calculated, as if it was aware of them, watching them with a hunger that went far beyond simple predation. "We can't outrun it," Henry said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to destroy the crystals now." Hala didn't respond with words, but the fire in her eyes said it all. She had already reached the center of the crystal formation, her gloved hands reaching out to manipulate the controls on her wrist device, fingers flying over the interface as the glow around them intensified. The pulse of the crystals had grown to a deafening level, vibrating the ground beneath them, the air thick with energy. "We're running out of time," Hala muttered under her breath, her voice tense. "I need more power." Henry turned to look at the creature, his eyes widening as it stepped into the dim light, its form finally revealed. It was like something out of a nightmare, a colossal, multi-limbed beast, its skin a sickly black, covered in a sheen of iridescent scales that reflected the flashing lightning in the sky. Its eyes, glowing a fiery red, locked onto them, and for the briefest moment, Henry thought he saw intelligence there. Whatever it wasn't a mindless predator. It was the protector, the guardian of something ancient and powerful, something hidden beneath the surface of this cursed planet. Hala's voice broke through his thoughts, urgent. "Henry, I need you to disable the perimeter now." Without thinking, Henry sprinted toward the crystal nodes that anchored the formation. The storm outside intensified, the winds howling louder, the air crackling with the same electric hum he had felt when first touching the crystals. As his hands flew over the interface, the ground beneath him shuddered again, the creature's roar echoing in the distance. The pulse of the crystals was deafening now, an almost physical force. "Come on," Henry muttered under his breath, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He could feel the weight of Hala's gaze on him, but the moment he pressed the final command into the interface, the entire formation shuddered violently. The hum died down briefly, but then a deep, guttural growl filled the air. The ground beneath them cracked open like a wound in the earth, and from the depths of the canyon, the creature's massive form surged forward, its monstrous mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Henry's pulse quickened as he turned to Hala, her face taut with concentration. "We need to finish this," he said, his words edged with desperation. "I'm trying," she snapped back, sweat beading on her forehead as she continued working. The energy from the crystals surged again, lighting up the night sky with an otherworldly glow. Suddenly the crystals cracked, slowly at first, then with violent intensity. The energy they had been pulsing with exploded outward, like a shockwave of pure power. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. And then it happened. The creature screamed, a sound so primal, so raw, it was like the planet itself was crying out in pain. The air vibrated with the force of it, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The massive beast stumbled, its massive limbs faltering as the glow from the crystals surged, the power they had absorbed now releasing in a blinding burst of light. Henry's eyes widened in disbelief as the creature lurched backward, its massive body writhing in agony. It was losing control. The crystals, now exposed to their full potential, were acting as a kind of shock absorber, redirecting the energy of the planet itself. "We did it," Henry shouted, but there was no time to celebrate. The beast, though staggered, was still alive, and its eyes locked onto them with a deadly, knowing fury. "We need to move now," Hala yelled, grabbing Henry by the arm and pulling him toward the shuttle. The creature let out a final roar, but this time, it wasn't one of rage. It was one of desperation. The ground beneath them began to quake violently as the creature's body convulsed. "Is it dying?" Henry asked breathlessly, his voice tinged with disbelief as they ran toward the shuttle. The beast's form flickered in and out of view, the storm outside swirling around it like a vortex. It was as if the creature was being pulled back into the earth, its energy draining into the very ground that had created it. Hala didn't answer, she didn't have to. The shuttle's hatch slid open with a hiss, and they both scrambled inside, barely managing to secure their harnesses before the shuttle shot upward, breaking through the storm and the violent winds. Below them, the planet of RX 792 continued to shake, the dying creature's roar fading into the distance. As the shuttle ascended, Henry sat back in his seat, his hands trembling from the adrenaline, his thoughts racing. "Is it over?" he asked, looking at Hala. She sat beside him, her face still set, her eyes scanning the rapidly disappearing surface of RX 792 below. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice laced with exhaustion, "but we've unlocked something, something big, something that the galaxy won't be able to ignore." Henry looked out the shuttle's window at the distant, storm-racked planet below. The creatures, the crystals, the ancient power, it was only the beginning. They had uncovered a piece of something that could change everything. And the galaxy wasn't ready for what came next. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon for more amazing videos.